Hello, this is our last video for Bible survey for the semester. So we have kind of reached the finish line and we're going to spend some time today, maybe a little less time than normal, looking at the book of Revelation, kind of the conclusion of the New Testament, the conclusion of the Bible for Christians. So one of the it's sometimes said about the book of Revelation that it's the most read or most talked about book in the Bible and least understood. It's a strange book. It's got a lot of kind of wild imagery going on, some battles, some creatures, the end of the world, Armageddon, all these kind of things. The beast, the Antichrist. So what's going on in this book? Like, what is it about? How are we to read it? And there are lots of different schools of interpretation for the book of Revelation. So what I'm going to try to do is put forward four of kind of the main groupings of how Christians have thought about this book, sort of interpretive schools, and then within one or two of those, there's many other, schools. Like, are you a pre-tribulation, post-tribulation, amillennial, premillennial, post-millennial? Like, there's a lot of different variations, and we're not going to get into any of that really. I'm going to stick to more just kind of these four broader categories of how Christians have understood it. And then I'm going to sort of pick two of those and talk about a few specific ideas or passages from within the book if you were using those two schools of thought. And then we'll kind of call that a wrap for the this discussion of the book of Revelation. Okay, so and I'm sending you a handout that I'm both emailing and posting on the Foxtail page that covers some of this material. So there's in the names of these four terms, you are going to need to know all four of these groupings for the final. But I didn't make cards for them today, but they'll be on this handout, so you'll have copies of this. So there's a bit of material in this video that you still may want to take notes on, but I would kind of look at that handout as you're listening to the video, and you may discover that the handout I'm sending covers, the majority of what we'll talk about here. So part of the question, in interpreting the book of Revelation is what to do with all of these images, right? What to do with all of this kind of strange language, these creatures that come out of the sea, that war with one another, creatures from heaven, creatures from Satan or the beast, and just what's going on and how do we interpret those, right? So if you'll recall back in the Old Testament, we talked about apocalyptic prophecy, right? And one of the arguments that's made about apocalyptic prophecy in the Old Testament is that it meant something very specific to the audience in which it was written, but it's not meant to be a coded message directly, like that every single image, because part of what makes apocalyptic is the inclusion of sort of strange images, creatures that do not exist in the actual physical world. We read in Ezekiel, this beast that had like four heads, and one was the head of a lion and the head of a bull and an eagle and a human, and it had wings, and the wings had hands, and the wings had eyes on it. And what does all that stand for? And is this wheel that's spinning in the sky and glowing with fire, is that a UFO of some kind? And what I suggested is, rather than with Old Testament apocalyptic, rather than trying to spend a lot of time trying to decipher, okay, what does each of these eyes stand for? What does each hand stand for? That one prevailing school of thought with apocalyptic is the main thing is hope, right? The main thing is the author is writing, the author has had a vision of some kind, and that's going to be true of the book of Revelation. We're going to see that the author is writing into a situation there's a crisis. There's a huge problem going on. In the Old Testament apocalyptic, it's the Babylonian exile. In the case of the book of Revelation, it's kind of oppression and persecution by the Roman Empire of the early Christians. And how do we maintain hope? How do we maintain hope that God is somehow going to prevail? And that what these kind of cosmic battles or images are mostly meant to portray is no matter how dark the situation is, no matter how problematic it seems where we are right now, God is bigger and God is going to prevail. No matter how much it seems like we're never going to leave quarantine with coronavirus, that God is bigger, and that the end of the story is God wins. Right? So that's true in kind of all apocalyptic. So the question then becomes, is that all apocalyptic is, or do the various symbols have some secret meaning? Right? So these four schools of thought basically take different approaches to answering that question. So the first school, and this is in your handout, is what is called the preterist school of interpretation. And in the preterist view, the book of Revelation is mostly a historical document. It's mostly meant for the specific situation of first century Christians facing Roman persecution. And all of the kind of battles and images are not for some time in the future, but they're more of saying Rome isn't going to win. The most powerful force in the universe is not the Roman emperor. Don't give up hope, right? And so the degree that there are coded ideas in these books, they would be all about the first century, right? That the Antichrist would be the Roman emperor, specifically the Roman Emperor Nero, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. That Babylon, the great Babylon, that does war with the armies of God, is not actually Babylon from the Old Testament, but is Rome instead. And that the first century readers would have understood that, like that they would have known, oh, we can't openly talk about how our God is going to overthrow eventually the Roman Empire, and that the Roman Empire is not going to defeat us, because that's treason, right, in the empire, and that would get us killed. But we can talk about Babylon, which for us, because we know the Old Testament means something, but for the Roman soldiers that might hear us talking or might find this letter and read it, it doesn't, they don't know what that means. They don't know the secret language, the code there. So in the preterist view, there is some sense that various images in the book have direct meanings. The Antichrist stands for Nero, the Roman emperor. Babylon stands for Rome, etc. But it's about their situation, right? And so that what we're mostly reading in the 21st century when we read Revelation are comments about what it was like to follow Jesus in the time of Roman persecution, and how they were thinking about that and framing that. So the preterist view is mostly kind of looking back into the book as a historical document. Okay, so it's still significant, it's still worth reading, but it's not. It's not a document that is intended to kind of transform, or give us a secret idea about the end of the world. The second view that I want us to look at is called and these next two are directly related. So in these two, it's the opposite approach. The first is going to be the historicist view, and the second is the futurist view. So in both of these two views, and there's some subtle differences, so they can kind of easily be confused. In both of these approaches, the book is predicting the end of the world and does have clues for us about how we can figure out when the end of the world is coming. In the historist view, that the clock, like the clock on the book of Revelation, or the clues in the book start in the first century. That the book in this view is describing world events from the time when John is sitting on the island of Patmos writes the book of Revelation until the end of the world. And the trick for understanding when the world is going to end and how the world is going to end is locating our place on the timeline, right? If the book is filled with clues of events, oh, this is the Protestant Reformation in 1500. Oh, this is the birth of the United States. This is the fall of the Soviet Union. Like it's kind of like trying to decipher the clues, the breadcrumbs, the that are left in the book and placing them in the right timeline. So maybe like some of you have maybe gone to churches or maybe grown up in churches that'll have like huge timelines of world history, right? And epics and eras and placing, or dispensations, sometimes they're called, and which dispensation are we in? Where on this timeline from the first century to the end are we? Are we halfway through? Are we 75% through? Are we in the last few minutes of this timeline? And that would be the historicist view, right? So, yes, the book is all about predicting the end. Yes, it has clues for us, but those clues start in the first century and go till the very end. So, and depending on how you decipher the clues, we may be, again, like just halfway through, we may be 99%, like we may be in the very last pages. Maybe this coronavirus is the beginning of the end times, or maybe the election of this president or that president, or this world event or that world event signals, it's a couple minutes till midnight, and the things are about to end, things are about to go down. So that's a historicist view. The futurist view, in some ways, is basically the same. It still is this idea that the book is filled with predictions for us to understand when the world is going to end, but all of them are still in the future, right? So if you grew up in a church that talks a lot about have we entered the end times, that would be like, have we entered where the book of Revelation begins, right? Like so in the futurist view, most of human history, the 2,000 years since Jesus is not part of the book because the world didn't end. The idea is that this is a fairly short, compact period of time that the book of Revelation is talking about. But once it starts, things will happen quickly, right? And we will decipher, oh, Trump is this. Oh, Amazon is that. Oh, the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, this is that, late 80s, this is that moment in history, et cetera, et cetera. So we're tracking, but it may or may not have started yet, right? So readers in this school of thought are kind of looking at the Revelation and looking around at the news, trying to figure out, has page one begun? Like, has the clock, if it's a wind-up clock, like, has it started? And now it's ticking down until the very end, till midnight. But the clock hasn't been running for thousands of years. But once it starts, man, things are really going to go, right? And so readers from this view, just like with the historicist view, are trying to figure out what each individual clue in the book might be. What is this? What is that? And I'm going to make some references about sort of the history of those two approaches in a moment. They've been tricky for a lot of Christians for a very long time, and we'll talk about that. The last view, in some ways, takes the preterist view and adds just a little bit to it, right? So if the preterist view was, it's mostly for the first century, it's mostly, like, that's who the book is about. That's what these images are. They're all about the Roman Empire. The idealist view says, yes, that's probably true, but it is also written directly for us, but in a more general sense, right? So rather than, and this kind of fits with the way I described the reading of Old Testament apocalyptic, right? That we don't read Ezekiel and try to decipher the eyes on those wings to figure out current events. We read those like, oh, this is something going on back then with the Babylonian exile, with the conquest of Jerusalem by Babylon, but it still has a message for us. We can read the book of Ezekiel and find God giving us hope for our situation, God giving us um, truth about what God is up to in the world in a general sense. That God wins, for example, that would be one of the most general premises, right? It's not the future of the universe, the future of time, the future of our souls are not up for question, up for grabs. Like, well, maybe Satan wins and the world just becomes one massive hellhole forever, or maybe God wins. We don't know. That's not what apocalyptic says. Like, no. At the end of the day, there is no question God is going to win. God's goodness, God's shalom, God's, love triumphs over everything. And that we can read the book of Revelation and find those specific ideas, or that we could also find themes of worship, for example. Like there's some scholars that have written books that really one unifying theme of the whole book of Revelation is creatures, humans, angels, otherwise, other creatures worshiping God. That really the point of this book is to remind us that all creation worships God in one way or another, or that is our proper place, and that there will come a time when that will be restored and everything will again worship God. That would be part of the idealist approach to interpreting. Okay, so which of those is right? In one sense, we don't know, right? Like it's very hard to say. And for a couple of reasons. One is in the two middle views, the historicist view and the futurist view. Um, a lot of Christians have tried those approaches, and a lot of Christians have been wrong. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple examples of in my lifetime. I'm going to give three quick examples in my lifetime of futurist or historicist approaches that turned out to be dramatically inaccurate. And I don't share these to make fun of them, right? Because super sincere Christians believed these things. They just turned out not to be accurate, which kind of shows the dilemma of putting too much stock in hey, if we can just decipher the code, if we can work out the jigsaw puzzle, we'll be able to figure out when the world ends. So when I was a kid, I can't remember exactly, but I know it was when I was in elementary school. Something happened at grocery stores that changed the world, right? It changed the world for millions of people. And so I remember going to the grocery store with my parents, usually with my mother, but sometimes my dad. And buying, because my brother and I were really little, and she would bring us along and for the weekly grocery shopping. And when you would get to the end, I know this is going to be hard to imagine, but like the person checking you out would take each item and then have to type into a calculating machine how much each item cost, right? Because there was no computer set up to do it. Like, so every item you purchase had to be typed in by hand, and then there was ticker tape that would just kind of keep a running total, and then at the end, that's how much you owed. And then something happened in the 70s when I was a kid that changed everything, right? And if I were in class, I would ask you what it was. I bet as you're listening, many of you will guess. It's demonstrated in this lovely product, this Diet Coke that I drink way too many of per day. But what do you see right there? The barcode, right? The barcode changed everything for shopping, right? Because now you could take an item, just slide it across, and a little light would read the barcode, and boom, it would enter the price into a computer and calculate the cost in a fraction of the time and with much less effort, right? And barcodes made shopping infinitely easier, right? And all of you you've never lived in a world where that wasn't just, well, of course, that's how you pay for things. That's how you go to a concert, you get your ticket scanned, you get on an airplane, they scan your ticket at the airport. That did not used to be the case. Barcodes were a revolutionary idea once. Okay, so this isn't a little walk down memory lane of U.S. history just to talk about barcodes. For Christians, I distinctly remember Christians when I was a kid talking about barcodes as a sign that the world was about to end, right? Because in Revelation, there are passages that during this great war, this great tribulation, one of the things that kind of these satanic armies, this army of the Antichrist, is going to do, the beast is going to put a mark on everyone. And that everyone will be forced to wear a mark that will identify whether they're a Christian or not a Christian. And that's part of what's going to happen at the very end. And so there were Christians that were convinced that the invention of barcode technology was a sign that that was the mark of the beast. Like, oh, they say they're just going to use it for Diet Coke. They say they're just going to use it for products in the store. Just wait. This is how they're going to label us. This is it. We now know we're in the book of Revelation. We are near the end of the world. And that was a distinct sign that that was about to happen. Now, that was about 50 years ago, 40 to 50 years ago. The world hasn't ended because of barcodes. If that triggered the end of the world, it did so quite subtly. There really hasn't been a case that all humans anywhere have been forced to wear barcodes on their wrist or in their forehead so that they could be identified everywhere they went. That seemed to be a mistake on Christians' part. I also remember a number of years later, I was now kind of in college, the Soviet Union. And for quite a while, the Soviet Union was viewed as part of the book of Revelation because that they were the great Babylon. And the United States was clearly God's army, of course, because who's more Christian than us, USA, number one, which is probably not exactly true. But in this interpretation, we represented the armies of God, and the Soviet Union, godless communists, represented the forces of Babylon, the forces of evil. And that at some point, there was going to be Armageddon, this great battle between us and the Soviet Union, and that would be how God would end the world. And again, remember the beast, there was the leader of the Antichrist of this great army of Babylon would have a mark. And then all of a sudden in the 80s, the Soviet Union got a new premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had a massive birthmark on his face, his forehead and cheek, and on one side of his face, this huge kind of brown birthmark. And again, Christians were like, what the crap? Like, could it be more obvious? He's the Antichrist. Right? He has the mark of the beast. He's the leader of the Soviet Union. We totally think that's the great Babylon, and he's got to be the Antichrist because he's got this mark on his face, right? How clear could it be? Well, it turns out Mikhail Gorbachev ended the Soviet Union. He broke it apart. He ended the Cold War. Him and Ronald Reagan. So. He did not lead to this great Armageddon, this great nuclear conflict that destroyed the world. The third kind of example, a few years back, there were billboards all around Newburgh, or actually up in Sherwood, but kind of all around the country, really. Christians took out billboards saying on May 24th, the world is going to end. Get ready. Get ready. May 20, I think it was 2012. I can't quite remember which year, but it was like May 24th, 2012, the world is going to end. And that is because there was a radio preacher in Arizona who had done all of this decoding, right? He had viewed the book of Revelation as this great jigsaw puzzle, and he had figured out that the world was going to end on May 24th, 2012 or whatever. And Christians were like selling, liquidating all of their assets, selling their homes, and using money to buy these billboards to advertise this, just giving away, here, have my car, have my house. I'm not going to need it because Jesus is going to take us home. Let's go to Hawaii. Let's spend all of our savings because the world only has 5 more days, 4 more days, 3 more days. So I was actually teaching Bible survey in the month of May to some Chinese students. It was a class of only Chinese students who were here for the summer, and I was their Bible survey teacher. And I recall on May 23rd, one of them just kind of told me, like, none of us are going to do our homework for tomorrow. Like we're not going to do the, and in that course it met very briefly, so they had reading every night. They had to turn in a reading summary every single day. They're like, we're just not going to do the homework. And I was like, well, why aren't you? You've been doing it every day for the class. Like, well, the world's going to end. Like we saw that billboard in Sherwood, right? And so why do homework? We're just going to go have a party tonight. Like we're not. And my comment was, I would maybe do the homework. I'm not sure, but I have a strong suspicion we are going to have class on May 24th. And sure enough, the day came and the world did not end. Right? So part of my skepticism about the historicist and futurist views is that they have often been wrong. Christians that have held those views. Because really, you can go all the way back to the earliest centuries of Christianity and find Christians who were convinced, looking around at wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and things happening in the world at the time they were living, and they would go, oh, look, this is just like the book of Revelation where the world's about to end. And over that has happened, and over again it hasn't come to pass, right? So at some point, I do believe Christ is going to return. Like I believe that from Scripture. I do think the world as we know it will end at some point. God will wrap up time in our sense. God will reconcile all things to Himself, and Jesus will return, and the world will end. Um, I'm pretty skeptical about spending very much time trying to decipher when exactly that is from the book of Revelation. Now, maybe the historicist view is accurate, maybe the futurist view is accurate. If so, it's been very complicated and very hard for Christians to figure out. And kind of my Diet Coke illustration and Mikhail Gorbachev and whatnot are just two of dozens upon dozens upon dozens examples of Christians who have thought they have figured it out from those two theories, and then been wrong. Thought they had could predict the world is going to end right here. Jesus is going to return in upstate New York on this date in the 1800s, and then Jesus didn't. In spite of thousands of people going to upstate New York waiting on that to happen. So I think, if nothing else, it's a safe bet that it probably did, like the preterist view says, that almost certainly in the first century, Christians thought it was talking about Rome. And I think it's very appropriate for us today to have hope in whatever difficult situation we're in, whether it's Christians during World War II when it feels like the entire globe is killing one another and on fire, or today when it feels like the entire world is holed up in their homes, terrified to leave because of a deadly virus. That no matter how dark or frightening history has been, or our present is, that God is bigger, and that God is going to win. That in spite of the darkness, in spite of the fear, in spite of forces like Rome that once felt so powerful, or the Soviet Union that once felt so powerful, or whatever fears and terrors may come, in spite of this disease, that is with us right now, that God is bigger and that God wins. Okay, so I think that those are two pretty safe bets. That it did mean stuff back then, somewhat specifically. It does mean stuff now, somewhat generally. Maybe those other two views, in one way or another, will prove to be right in the long run. But personally, I'm not spending much time trying to figure that out. Right, there are a handful of passages in Revelation that I think provide beautiful pictures of hope for the future, and I'm going to end this video in our course reading one or two of those. And I think there's also some stuff in here that kind of gives clues to what maybe the first century Christians thought was happening, and we'll look at that as well, and then we'll wrap up. So I already mentioned this idea that Babylon, like when you see Babylon in the book of Revelation, you're probably seeing Rome. That for the first century Christians, that was probably like a coded way of, let's talk about the empire that's brutalizing us. Let's talk about the emperor who holds our life in his hands. Let's talk about the persecution we're experiencing. But we can't talk about it openly, so we talk about it in code. We use Babylon when really we mean Rome. So I think that's one clue. But who is this Antichrist, right? There's an Antichrist that appears over and over again that has a number, 666. And this Antichrist is going to have a ton of power and people are going to follow him. And yet he's going to be profoundly evil. And who is that? Um, and people, like today, Google Antichrist and you'll find like it's Hillary Clinton, it's Donald Trump, it's Michael Jackson. It's who name you can find anybody listed as the Antichrist. Um, I think it seems very likely that in the book of Revelation, who the Antichrist was probably Emperor Nero of Rome. Now, at the time of the writing of this book, Nero is dead. He had died a few decades earlier, but he had been, during the early years of Christianity, one of the first Roman emperors to kill and persecute Christians in any kind of widespread way. So he had been opposed to Jesus, anti-Christ, anti-Christian. He had had an incredible amount of power. But a few things about Nero specifically. So he was an egomaniac, right? Like he viewed himself as God. He had coins printed up, Nero did, that he was the savior of the world, that he was the light of the world, that he was bringing salvation to, like, that Rome wasn't oppressing you, we're actually liberating you. We're bringing you the glory that is Rome, and I am the one who is doing it. Only I can fix it. Only I can bring the glory of Rome. And so I, Nero, am a god. I, Nero, am the world's savior. And there's kind of, on Roman coins from Nero's time as emperor, from writings, a ton of language that has Nero talking about himself in ways that sound very similar to how we see Jesus talking in the Gospel of John, or how Christians believe who Jesus was, kind of setting himself up as an alternative to Christ, a different Christ, or if his kind of Christness, his kind of saviorness, his kind of being Lord is the opposite of Jesus, that he would be an anti-Christ, right? There also, he had died, but there was kind of a cult of Nero in the Roman Empire. He was both a hated and feared emperor, but also had a pretty profound kind of obsessive cult-like following. And in the kind of cult of Nero, we have ancient kind of Roman writings that suggest that his followers believed that he would come back to life. That even though he had died, he would return. He would rise from the dead and return again. Just as Christians believed that Jesus had died and was physically resurrected and was going to return. Right? So again, Nero is like Jesus, but the opposite. But he's talked about. He's talked about as Savior of the world. He's talked about as having died, but will come back to life. He will return and take over power once again. Also, in Jewish culture, there's this stuff called numerology, which is like adding up letters. Each letter in the Hebrew alphabet stands for a certain number as well. And you add up numbers of names, and the numbers then become very significant. And there's kind of pure numbers and holy numbers. 3, 7 are kind of, numbers of completion and purity. 7 days in the week. That's the Sabbath is on the seventh day. The seventh is kind of God's number. 7 is kind of God's number. And then anything outside of that, to take God's number and corrupt it, is also a sign of being anti-God, right? So if you add up, and I don't know how to do it, but I know this is kind of the thought process behind Jewish numerology. If you add up the names of Nero, the name of Nero, and all these numbers, you get this total of 666, right? And if God's perfect number is 7, 7, I don't know, 7, and another godly number, like we've talked about, triple repetition, is 3, right? So 7, God's number 3 times, is really emphasizing God. To pervert that would be to take 6, which is God's number -1, God's number broken or perverted, and then triple repeat that number, 666. Well, that's the number of Nero's name, right? So the idea kind of being that probably for the early readers, they would encounter all of these. The Antichrist has this number 666, and go, oh, this is we're totally talking about Nero here, and that he's not going to return, and that Christ, the God, is more powerful than the emperor, and that the Roman soldiers who might intercept this letter, they don't understand that, but it's how it is, right? So I think it's very likely for the first century readers that's what those things meant. I think for us, I think the message is God, have hope in the future, and I want to close with um, a couple things from the last couple chapters of Revelation, and then we'll wrap up. So here is this picture. So there's this the end of time, and I want to talk about the end of hell, and then the New Jerusalem, and I want to read directly from the text. So this is from chapter 20. The sea gave up the dead and all the dead that were in it, and death and hell gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. And then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Okay, like what is that talking about? Like our souls in hell, they're kind of suffering, and then they're going to be thrown into this lake of fire where they are going to suffer more. Like, so in scripture, when the lake of fire, that's an image that appears at various points in the Old Testament. The lake of fire typically means where things go that they are completely destroyed. They cease to exist, right? So what did this text say? That hell will give up its dead. Like that hell, that all this, that one interpretation of this is that the souls that are in hell will be taken out of it, and then hell will be destroyed. Death will be destroyed because God will triumph over them, right? That even hell itself cannot exist in the face of God at the end. So that, maybe raising at least the possibility that hell is not something that extends on forever, but has a terminus, has an end point, and God defeats it, throws it into the lake of fire. And then immediately after that, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. And I heard a loud voice from the throne say, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. And they will be his people, and God himself will be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Okay, so I want to just very quickly make a handful of comments about this. The first being, I don't know if you noticed this, it does not say, I looked and I saw Christians evacuating earth and going off to heaven, right? It doesn't have us leaving earth. I remember seeing a Christian bumper sticker, in case of the rapture, this car will be unoccupied, because like the Christian was going to be driving down the highway and the rapture was just going to take them away. No, how does Revelation end? Heaven comes here. The world is made new. The world is born again, and heaven and earth are joined together, right? Think back to where did this story start? In a garden, right? Where everything, God and humans dwelt with one another. God walked in their midst. Well, here at the end, that's all returned. Like we're back in the garden. We're back in this world where God makes his dwelling place among the people. And there are no tears. There is no sadness. Every tear is wiped from their eyes. There is no more death or mourning or crying, because God has wiped all of that away. And then jumping over just a little bit, and this will be where we end. And I looked and I saw the temple. This is the New Jerusalem. There was no temple in the city. Like, how can you have Jerusalem without a temple, right? The reason there is no temple is because the Lord God and the Lamb being Jesus, are its temple. The city does not need a sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God is its light. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will come into this city. And on no day will the gates of this New Jerusalem ever be shut, for there is no night, and there is no one to keep out. Right? So there's no sense of like heaven and hell doing war with one another. Like now, The doors aren't locked. There's no street lights. There's no alarm systems. There's no locking the gates of the city because we're afraid of evil. Like all that's left is God's goodness. All that's left is we don't need a temple to go to pray to God because God is everywhere now. God is with us. God is present with us. Um, and then these last words. And then I looked and I saw a tree in the middle of the city, the tree of life. Remember, so we started in a garden, but now we're in a city, but there's a tree in the middle of this city. And there's a river that flows from that tree. And this river is for the healing of the nations, right? I looked, and on each side of the river there stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and its servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. Right? So there's this idea that everything is made new. Like the story has kind of gone full circle. It started in the garden with shalom, and then it goes wrong in Genesis 3, and then the rest of the Bible is the story of how is God going to respond to everything that's been ruined, all that's been broken. And now in Revelation, we're back at the beginning. Only now there's a city in the garden, and there's a tree and there's a river, and the river is for the healing of not just us, but all the nations, right? When the Bible talks about the nations, the healing of the nations, that means the Gentiles, like that everyone is that the kings of all the nations come into this city. Everyone is included, and every tear is wiped away, and everyone is brought into this relationship and communion with God because of the Lamb. And we didn't stress this earlier, but another theme that runs through the book is how does this happen? Right? What is it that defeats evil? Is it more evil? Like is Satan's army defeated by God's more powerful army? No. Who is worthy to defeat Satan? Who is worthy to take the scroll? At one point, the book of Revelation says, a lamb, a weak, tender, gentle lamb, a wounded lamb, a crucified lamb, right? The weakness of God is stronger than human strength. The foolishness of God, Paul says, is wiser than human wisdom. And at the end, what is it that makes everything right? The lamb, the crucified lamb, the wounded lamb, the gentle lamb, the lamb that brings love, that brings healing. Jesus. Jesus is that lamb. So that the answer to evil is not more power, more guns, more tanks, more walls, more fighting, more war, more. No, it's love. It's the lamb, Jesus, who is crucified, the lamb who was slain. He is the one who is worthy. He is the one that can bring healing for the world, for the nations. And I just find that to be a beautiful message of hope, of God's redeeming love, that Hesed, Hesed, I've not given up on you, humans. I've not given up on you, creation. And at the end of everything, Hesed will reign again, and Shalom will be restored, and all will be made right. This has been a strange semester. It has been hard to do class this way. This isn't how any of us would have envisioned going through Bible survey. It's hard for me because I love this stuff. I love all of it, and I love these last words. And I wish I were with you face to face so that you could feel kind of my emotion in the beauty and hope I think that Revelation gives us. But as best we can, we've tried to do it together online like this. So blessings on you as you prepare for the final and wrap up your other classes and move into the summer. And hopefully move into a time that will look more like the world as we've known it and less like um, running around in our pajamas all day, not leaving the house, and just being on the internet constantly. But thank you for the work you've done, and blessings.